Good morning and welcome to today's PSHE lesson. So the 1st of May was International Labour Day, sometimes known as May Day. And it's a day which is dedicated to workers and labourers across the world. Sometimes it's called International Day of Workers or the International Labour Day, but quite often commonly shortened to May Day in English language. And it's a day which celebrates labourers and encourages them to be aware of their rights. Every person who works has rights which are established by the United Nations. So International Labour Day on the 1st of May will be a public holiday in most countries around the world. And the International Labour Organization, which is part of the United Nations, works in setting standards for labour across the world. And in a recent report, they have said countries need to put in place sound and resilient occupational safety and health systems that would minimise the risk for everyone in the workplace in the event of future health emergencies. Labour Day honours people who work hard across the world and celebrates their achievements. One of the dark secrets of international labour is the involvement of children in labour. Children having to work, and children as young as children in primary school who work essentially as slaves to produce some of the goods that we take for granted in Morocco and in other developed nations. The areas of child labour which I'm going to focus on for today's PSHE lesson will be particularly the chocolate industry and the harvesting of cocoa in some of the poorest parts of the world where children are used to harvest and to pick the cocoa, and also the textile industry. And it's a real eye-opener to see where a lot of the clothes that we may buy and is sold in shopping malls across the world originates from. And hopefully when you are more aware, you can make choices based upon that awareness. If we don't know, then there's no reason to change our behaviour. But once we're aware of a situation, we really have to challenge ourselves as to the morality of our actions. If we know that a piece of clothing has been manufactured in a factory using child labour, should we still buy the clothing? If we know that the particular brand of chocolate which we may choose to eat is a result of cocoa harvesting in Ghana or Ivory Coast, for example, Sierra Leone, where there's a lot of cocoa farming, should we still eat that brand of chocolate? Because there are ethical alternatives in the clothing industry and in the confectionery industries. So the first thing we want to do during the PSHE lesson is just challenge our assumptions and challenge what we take for granted and think about how should this affect our behaviour. And beyond that, again, as I talk about probably every week, is then what should we do in terms of actions and advocacy. So watch the videos and see what you think about the way certain children around the world are treated and have to work on this time of International Labour Day.
Who's behind it? Kids, some as young as 10, are fueling a child labor movement in the cocoa fields of Western Africa. Our Catherine Pope takes us to Ghana with a look at the darker side of chocolate.
Children in Canada love eating chocolate, but while they indulge in this sweet treat, some children who have never tasted chocolate are forced to work on cocoa bean farms in West Africa.
It's very sweet.
Chocolate is made from cocoa beans, which grow in pods on trees.
You have some beans in it, counting about 50 to 60 beans. You can eat it like toffee. But the rare bean, if I bite it, is very bitter.
Cocoa beans are Ghana's biggest cash crop, but it's a bittersweet harvest because of the common use of child labor. Ghana's Gold Coast, as it used to be known, was once the center of West Africa's slave trade. In some ways, the practice continues. To find the children of the cocoa bean, we drove hundreds of kilometers down bumpy, almost impassable roads and trekked deep into the heart of the cocoa region. This teenager says he's been toiling at this every day since he was 13. BK is just 9 years old. He spends 8 hours a day working the cocoa beans. The use of child labor and the trafficking of children to work on the cocoa bean farms is a problem the government is struggling to deal with. Matthew Daly investigates child trafficking.
Conditions generally are bad for them. It's generally bad for them. They work under very harsh conditions, under very terrible environments. Some are beaten up.
Everywhere we went, children told us stories about abusive labor conditions. He said his mother wouldn't feed him unless he worked. This little girl's job was to spray the cocoa with insecticides.
At what age did she start working in the cocoa bean farm?
9 years.
13 years.
13 years now.
This boy worked 7 days a week, tending the cocoa pods.
He was weeding. He used to weed.
In this part of the world, even the wealthiest cocoa bean farmer makes less than $500 per year. They live in small huts with large families. There is no electricity, running water, or sewer systems. Elementary school is free, but some parents force their children to work instead.
Why were your children working on the cocoa bean farm?
Because I were not having money.
Is that wrong to use children on the cocoa bean farms?
Yes.
You think so?
Yes.
But you needed the money.
Yes.
The big chocolate companies say they're doing their part to help conditions for children working on the cocoa farms. But only one, Cadbury, has promised to use fair trade cocoa in one of its candy bars. And none were available for an on-camera interview with 16 by 9.
Even more disturbing is the buying and selling of children. Traffickers sometimes pay parents for their child, then move them onto the cocoa bean farms. Child labor is not uncommon in Ghana. This 6-year-old works 12 hours a day selling water.
How much? Say? 100 cedis.
She'll make about 40 cents by sunset. This boy works 7 days a week sifting for gold.
How much could a child potentially be bought for?
On the average, about 200,000 cedis.
Which is about
$20 thereabout.
But the Ghanaian government is under pressure to rid the cocoa bean farms of child labor because Westerners are huge consumers of chocolate. So they're trying to get the kids off the farms and into school. The government pays for the children's uniforms and books. Their parents give in groceries to compensate them for the loss of the child labor. And for the first time, they're allowed to play, a freedom some never had because they were too busy working the cocoa beans. Rita Damoa of the Farmers Union believes children must be educated, not forced to work.
It means we are denying the children that of going to school. So it's bad. It means it will affect the child in future.
Farmers are starting to realize the benefits of fair trade. If they join the union, they get a guaranteed fair price for their beans. Child labor is not allowed, and the profits go back into the community. Fair trade beans paid for this water pump, providing clean, fresh drinking water for everyone, a luxury this village has never been able to afford. And other equipment, like this small corn mill, have been purchased with the profits from fair trade, so people are getting better nutrition. The Farmers Union is trying to encourage chocolate brokers to buy more of it.
What would you like people who eat chocolate in Canada to know?
I just want people in Canada to go in for fair trade chocolate, because just a bite of the chocolate, as I've said, has a greater impact on the lives of the people over here. So they should go in for the fair trade produce, and that will help us a lot.
In Canada, fair trade chocolate is regulated by Transfair. Michael Zelmer says buying fair trade makes a huge difference.
It means that they won't be forced to work on farms, which is a problem that's endemic in Western Africa. There's a lot of child slavery on cocoa farms and just child labor in general. And so with the fair trade certification standards, you're not allowed to have, well, certainly there's no forced labor, and then labor of children under 15 years of age is also controlled. Essentially, it's that it cannot prevent them from going to school, it can't do anything that will affect their life chances. It's also important because it ensures that their families get paid a decent price for their labor. And fair trade certified cocoa comes entirely from democratically run cooperatives of small-scale producers.
That will triple the amount of fair trade chocolate produced in Guyana. But in a country saddled with crushing poverty, the use of child labor is endemic. And that's a problem Canadian children will never get a taste of.
If I asked you, do you support child labor or sweatshop labor? Do you think human trafficking is evil? I am quite certain that 99.9% of you in this room today would say, I do not support child labor or sweatshop labor. I think human trafficking is terrible. So let me ask you then, how many of you can say with certainty that the clothes you're wearing right now have not been made in a sweatshop or by child labor? How many of you can say for sure that the cotton in your clothing wasn't picked by children who were trafficked onto work in cotton farms? The truth is, it's very hard to know where the material used to make our clothing comes from, or how our clothes were made. The clothing supply chain is a complex system. Perhaps this is what our clothing label should look like. Currently, only 5% of companies know where all their inputs come from. So how then can you make sure that your purchasing decisions do not contribute to child labor, human trafficking, or environmental degradation? The answer is ethical clothing, an idea that has been widely discussed over the last 10 years. Ethical clothing can be defined as an approach to the design, sourcing, and manufacturing of clothes that maximizes benefits to people and communities while minimizing the impact on the environment. Ethical clothing is even more relevant today due to the emergence of a new trend called fast fashion. Now, when I say fast food, what words come to mind? For me, I immediately think fast, cheap, and bad. It's similar with fast fashion, where fashion has changed from seasonal styles to something new nearly every week. Prices of clothing has also dropped substantially over time. You can now buy a t-shirt for as little as $7 and a pair of jeans for $15. To keep these prices low, companies outsource their clothing production to countries such as Bangladesh, where wages are very low. Currently, over 92% of clothing sold in Australia is made overseas. They don't just absorb this loss of profit resulting from lowering their prices. They try and pass it down the supply chain in an attempt to offset their loss until it reaches those who cannot pass it down anymore. They are your most vulnerable, those who have no voice. They are your garment factory workers in Bangladesh, China, Cambodia, the poor cotton farmers in India, and the child slaves working in cotton farms in Uzbekistan. There are currently 14.2 million people in forced labor, and 168 million child laborers scattered across the globe. More than half the population of Australia works in forced labor, and 7 times the population of Australia in child labor. Most of these people are forced to work in the farms and factories that produce the inputs for our clothing industry. Their wages are so low that they're unable to lift themselves and their families out of poverty, and thus the cycle just continues. Apart from lowering wages, firms also try to offset their loss by asking suppliers to cut their wholesale prices. Suppliers say that because they're desperate for business, they don't really have a choice. Either cut their prices or lose out on business. Suppliers then try and offset their losses by cutting back on maintaining a safe work environment, which can lead to tragedies such as the Rana Plaza collapse in 2013, where 1,130 people died. 4 times the number of people in this building today lost their lives because of someone else's negligence. But people say, are we not doing them a favor by giving them business and stimulating their economy? Isn't working in a factory at any wage better than the other alternatives available to them? For example, working as a prostitute, or selling your child into slavery, or leaving your village, your family, and your children behind for months on end to work for wickedly low wages and unsafe working conditions. This is not a choice. This is the exploitation of vulnerability. Companies are profiting off their need to work. We need to respect these people, treat them like we would treat workers in Australia, because this would not happen in Australia. We have strong unions and fair work practices. When we speak, people listen. But you can be their voice. By being mindful about what and how often you buy, you are saying that you value the lives of these people enough to pay a little extra to ensure that they're taken care of. To ensure that a Bangladeshi garment factory worker is paid a living wage adds an extra 3 to 5% on top of the retail price that you pay in the shops. For example, that adds an extra 70 cents to $1 to your $15 pair of jeans. In addition, the amount that is paid to suppliers in garment factories accounts to only 10 to 20% of the total price that you pay as a customer in the shops. This 10 to 20% includes everything up to the point of shipping, such as sourcing of raw material, the manufacturing of the garment, and the payment of middlemen profits. So then I know that if I paid $7 for a t-shirt, the supplier was paid between 70 cents to $1.40. Common sense then tells me that his workers were not paid a whole lot. Nick Servetus, the founder of the Australian ethical fashion brand Ethico, talks about moving from a conscious to a conscientious shopper. In other words, moving from being just aware of a problem to actually doing something about it. He says that managing an ethical supply chain is challenging, but nowhere near as hard as getting individuals and organizations to change their values and beliefs. According to a LOHAS report, only 10% of Australians make consistent green or ethical purchasing decisions. This is a huge discrepancy to the 90% of Australians that said they care about an issue. In addition, clothing brands say that they're unwilling to stock ethically made clothes because A, they're not convinced that customers actually care, and B, that by stocking ethically made clothing, they worry about what it might say about the other, presumably non-ethically made clothing in their shops. This just highlights to me the power that we have as consumers. Now, I acknowledge that this issue can seem really overwhelming. Perhaps you're feeling helpless, but there is hope. Your everyday purchasing decisions and choices can help lift a person and their family out of poverty. I suggest starting with 3 simple steps. Number 1, buy less. When you go into a shop, ask yourself, do you really need that item of clothing? British journalist Lucy Siegel calls it getting more fashion mileage out of your clothing. She says that if you cannot commit to wearing something for a minimum of 30 times, don't buy it. Number 2, look for brands that have a fair trade accreditation for start. Suppliers won't stock clothing brands that are not selling. You, the customer, are in charge. Buying from companies that treat their workers and the environment well not only affirms their ethical decisions, but it also encourages other companies to take similar action. Thirdly, research. Do some research on the company that you want to buy from. From where do they source their raw materials? How much do they pay their workers? But it sounds tedious and time-consuming, doesn't it? Well, it is. But the really good news is that there are many organizations working hard to enable us to make everyday ethical purchasing decisions. For example, Baptist World Aid, an Australian NGO, published an annual ethical fashion guide that grades around 300 companies that sell in Australia against criteria such as payment of a living wage, knowledge of supply chain. They make this indispensable resource available to everybody for free. You can download it off their website or from the TEDx page. You can also download an app called Good On You that enables you to compare and rate different companies. There can be a very happy ending to this story. Since Baptist World Aid released the first ethical fashion guide in the wake of the Rana Plaza tragedy, the number of companies working to keep track of their inputs has increased from 49% to 79%. 32% of companies are now paying minimum wage or higher. This is so encouraging because it demonstrates how much influence our voices can have. I used to think that the elimination of the fashion industry was the only answer, but as I did my research, I realized that we can use this very same industry as a tool to lift a country's living standards. It's one of the fastest growing industries in the world today. 40 million people in Asia alone work in garment factories. The fashion and clothing industry can play a huge role in reshaping the economy of a country. However, it is clear that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. This industry still fuels child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, environmental degradation, especially in developing countries, exploitation, and unsafe working conditions. Your voices and your purchasing decisions have so much power to change the direction in which the fashion and clothing industry is taking the world. You are all now aware of this issue. It is my hope that after today, 100% of TEDx Townsville will move from conscious to conscientious and contribute to a world free from poverty and exploitation. Thank you.
So that's from a TED Talk. TED Talks are amazing. They are an opportunity for people to speak out about issues which they care passionately about. That one came from Australia, and you can hear how the young person in question is passionate about the textile industry and the use of child labour, and how she is willing to change her behaviour in order to make the world a better place and to protect children. Now, are we willing to do the same? One thing I want you to do as homework, something you've been working on this week, is put together your own TED Talk. So do a bit of research into this issue around child labour. There's lots of different industries. In fact, probably the most common use of child labour in the world, other than agriculture, is domestic service. Young children being forced to work in people's houses as maids, as gardeners, or similar, at a low wage and with no access to education. Now, sometimes we might think that this is something which is just in far-off countries or some of the poorest countries in the world, but it exists in developing nations, it exists in Europe, it exists in North America, and it exists in Morocco. And I'm going to show you a short clip of the story of some young girls in Morocco. And it's not just a negative story, because we need to be solution-oriented. And we'll see the work of this project, which is giving hope and education to some young girls in this country who previously had little hope and were working as child labourers. As we watch it, please think about, well, what can we do? What can we do in terms of advocacy? Maybe when you're considering your own TED Talk for your homework, you could think about something local. One thing you'll be aware of from global perspectives, those of you in lower secondary, is the fact that you're often asked to think globally, think about global problems that affect every country in the world, but you're also asked to act locally. What can we do in our own communities, in our own country, to make a difference? So think about that, and think about what can you do, because it's very easy to think someone else will do something. But as we've seen in previous assemblies, it's people your age who make a huge difference in the world. Last week, we see Malala and her work on children's rights to education, and particularly girl children. Previously, we've seen some clips of two young girls in Indonesia and Bali who had led a project to abolish plastics from their island. So could you be the people to lead forward these projects? Why not? It always starts with someone. And one thing I showed you right at the beginning of these PSHE sessions was the story of the hummingbird. And the hummingbird just did the little bit that it could in order to make a difference. So what can you do?
Look closely in the vibrant street markets of Rabat or Casablanca, and you'll find hundreds of children, some as young as 7 years old, working 40 hours or more every week. There are more than 600,000 child laborers in Morocco, 11% of the country's children, and half of them are girls.
I
have been working as a domestic laborer in South Morocco for 2 years. I was working hard. My employers were beating me. Whenever I saw children going to school, it reminded me that I could not go to school myself, and I was heartbroken.
With no chance to go to school, El Bouktaweya and others like her will grow up illiterate, poor, and desperate. But on a cliff edge along the rocky Moroccan shore, a sign of hope is rising above the crumbling walls of an old fortress. Inside is another world, not one of desperation, but a world of magic, illusion, excitement, and a chance at a new life. Here at the Circus School, children trapped in the cycle of poverty and child labor can experience a world they never dreamed possible. Thanks to the efforts of a local community group, after free lessons in juggling and trapeze practice, they spend time in a nearby classroom, going to school just like most other girls their age. Outside the circus tent, the realities in Morocco are slowly changing. Child labor rates have fallen slightly in the past 10 years. Experts with ILO's International Program for the Elimination of Child Labor and other organizations say that's in part due to innovative programs like the Circus School and to a dramatic rise in school enrollment. Morocco now offers primary school education to almost all children, with enrollment jumping from 52% in 1991 to 92% today. El Bouktaweya is one of the success stories. She's 16 now and in the 5th year of her primary education. Child labor is part of her past, not her future, but the risks remain.
In Morocco, more than 40% of the population are at or below the poverty line. That makes it all the more likely that a death, a divorce, or a disability in the family will mean that children will be sent out to work to replace lost family income.
For girls like El Bouktaweya, the Circus School is no illusion. It is a dream come true. A unique chance at an education and the skills to win a paying job and a better life for her and her family.
So now it's your turn. As I said, I want this to be your homework, to come up with your own speeches, your own TED Talks. They can be 5 minutes long or longer. You can do them individually or you can do them as a group. I don't mind. You can do them as an MP3 or an MP4. So it can be submitted as audio or video. I encourage you all to take part in this. The only people who are exempt will be year 11, 12 and 13 because of their exam classes that they're doing now in the middle of exams. But for years 7, 8, 9, 10, let's make a good effort of this. Let's make some products, some outcome, which we may be able to share on our school social media and show that we care. And the British School Casablanca isn't just going to sit back and watch the world go by, but we are going to make a difference and make our world a fairer, more just place for all people, and particularly for children.